Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session. My name is Shogun Ali Khan, and I'm the Chief Information Officer for the University of Central Asia. The University of Central Asia is pleased to launch a series of public lectures as part of pre-conference events for the Digital Transformation in Central Asia Conference to be held in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan from October 4th to 6th, 2019. University of Central Asia and the High Technology Park of the Kyrgyz Republic will host the joint conference aimed at providing IT leaders the opportunity to connect with over 100 chief information officers and IT leaders within Central Asia and abroad to collaborate and solve the technology problems together. To register or for more further information on the conference speakers and program, please visit dtca.kg or ditco.kg. Welcome to the first live streaming public lecture by the University of Central Asia. Our today's topic is evolving technology and emerging issues. I am honored and privileged to welcome the speaker for today's public lecture, Brian Lesser. Brian Lesser is the Chief Information Officer, CIO, at Ryerson University in Canada. Since 1995, he has held several positions in computing and communications services, including Manager, Academic Computing, and Assistant Director, Application Development and Support. Lesser helped lead Ryerson's move to Google Apps for education and the renewal of the university's online learning tools. He also helped deliver Ryerson's first identity management system, establish Ryerson's e-learning support team, and is a founder member of Ryerson's Digital Media Zone, DMZ, steering committee. The DMZ is Ryerson's startup incubator and accelerator. It has been ranked as the #1 university-based incubator in the world. Before working at Ryerson, Lesser worked in the thin film science lab at the Xerox Research Center in Canada and in the photograph conservation lab of the National Archive of Canada. Please welcome Brian Ryerson.
Thanks, Jessica. So I will try to do this in about 35 minutes so everyone can ask me questions. And also, because I've had to go full screen so you can see the slides, I can't see the chat window. So Shoka, maybe you could ask some questions as we go. Based on what
a little bit loud, Brian.
Sorry. How's that? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just hold the mic close and hope for the best. Okay, so without further ado, and so just a reminder, I can't see the chat window, so maybe Shaukat, you could just pass on questions as needed. So I'll just get going. In the abstract, I had this little note about how we've seen staggering promises. There are lots of opportunities and many uncertainties. So I thought I'd just use that phrase as a way to weave together this presentation. So I hope that works for everybody. So I want to start off by talking about staggering promises. There's certainly been many of them from vendors and prognosticators in higher education. So I thought maybe this was a good place to start. At the turn of the century, there were a bunch of French color cards that were being sold, predicting what was going to happen in 100 years, in the year 2000. And this is one of them. You may have seen this, where they predicted that, you know, knowledge was in books, and therefore books could be fed into a machine, and somehow electronically knowledge would be provided directly into students. So this has not come true, but it's a persistent dream that people have. Edison, shortly after, in 1913, who was working on the invention of the motion picture, like several other people, predicted that also books would go away, and that people would be visually taught. And so this is a theme. People seem to have a problem with books. I'm not sure why. But we found in one study at Ryerson and at other places that actually students prefer books in many cases, and that the idea of digitized learning or digitized information is appealing in many cases and very helpful in many, but it's not the be all and end all. And we actually studied our students and asked them surveys and so forth, and they had many reasons why they wanted to continue to use books, including marking them up and so forth. So it's not the simple, electronic future that we're facing that was perhaps predicted. However, people have been working away at creating online tools, electronic tools. And so I think the earliest example that I'm aware of was the 1970s first example of computer-based training. Computer-based training has been with us for a long time. And some of the advantages of this are fairly obvious. You can simulate something so someone gets has more visual impact, they can work with it, it's interactive and so forth. So there are advantages to this. But this system was perhaps the first example of someone really working on a simulation, doing some interesting work, having good science behind it. But as a commercial venture, it went nowhere and eventually folded up. So again, we get lots of people making lots of predictions. This is Nathan Harden saying the universities are about to end. And if you're reading this and you're a nervous university administrator, you might be a little concerned. Although much of this narrative came out of the United States, and I'll talk about that a little bit in the future, and is perhaps not that relevant in other countries. Even the difference between the United States and Canada is fairly stark, and so we saw these predictions and sort of wondered why people were making them. Here's another one from Clay Shirky, or Sharkey, I'm not sure how you say his name. And so a lot of these entrepreneurs looked at the disruption in the music industry and in other areas where intermediaries, retail stores, and so forth were being disrupted, and so companies were able to go with, for example, music sales directly to people and didn't need an intermediary at all. And so the music player was kind of the poster child for that kind of disruption. And for many people, it was the massive open online course, or MOOC, that was going to be the disruption. But I want to just sort of make a point about this. They were able to sell these devices directly to people, download and stream music to them. And so again, retail stores started folding up. I think maybe there's one store in Toronto left out of many that still sells CDs. And
sorry to stop you, Brian.
Sure.
Can you be a little bit loud, because it seems like the voice is not very clear.
Okay, I have the mic as close as I can, I think. How does that now?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so I'll just keep it really close.
Yes.
Interrupt me again if it's a problem. Okay, so by having devices in people's hands, they could basically bypass retail stores. And so I think they all want to have this. So this is my one joke for the slides. This is out of a 1960s science fiction television show. And everyone wants to have this sort of direct into the mind placement of knowledge. But this is total fiction. We have no idea how to do this. And the metaphor or analogy with the music industry, I don't think really holds up at all. What's really driving this is the cost of education and the demographics in the United States. So there was a huge increase in the number of students who wanted to go to university in the last 40 years or so. And the cost in the United States of going to university has just skyrocketed. So this is one of the big drivers behind all of this rhetoric and the investment in online learning and e-learning as an industry, trying to replace the professor, trying to replace the university. But the reality has been very different from that. So the idea of massive open online courses was that you could have thousands of students in them. They could attend the course and everything would be great. But the reality was the students who were actually paying for the course and proceeding towards a degree or certificate were the ones who actually completed these courses, and the thousands of people who actually attended them, didn't complete them. So the whole idea of MOOCs has basically failed, and all the providers of MOOCs in the United States are now moving to paid courses with smaller numbers of students in them. and curating them a lot more so that the conversations among students and with the professor are much more productive. So those were some of the staggering promises, and you're probably aware of many others from vendors. So I'll move on to the opportunities, which is perhaps the more interesting part of this. So there are many. One of them, though, or at least many of these, are based on the idea of ubiquity or pervasiveness of computing. So everyone likes to assume that everyone has good internet access and everyone has multiple devices now that they can view content on. And once that's true, or if that's true, then there are many things you can do to reach them and give them flexible access to learning. And so, of course, we've seen many simulations since the 1970s evolve, and there are some wonderful things out there. Adaptive learning has been a thing people have been working on for a while with artificial intelligence. I'll talk about that some more. And of course, one of the things our students really enjoy and people forget is that we're used to providing courses and thinking we're giving them everything they need. But there's so many online resources like Khan Academy and the MOOCs that are still around and so forth, that students can go elsewhere for materials when their lecturer maybe doesn't provide what they need. But one of the biggest drivers is flexible learning. And we find for our students that excuse me, many of them work, have kids, etc. They need a way to reschedule things, and so online courses are a huge boon to them. My university has about 400 courses online, and many of our program students who you would think would go to their classes will elect to take those courses instead in order to make their schedule work. And of course, cloud services and other AI areas I'll talk about in a bit. So again, if you take a North American-centric view of all of this, people have huge access to systems and they're using them more and more, especially on social media. Sometimes I wish they would stick to their desktop a little more, but you can see the numbers from the States. And in Canada, it's very similar. This is one site that says we have 87% of people online. But among our students in the Greater Toronto area, we are well into the close to the 100% mark. But of course, this isn't the same everywhere in the world. And so I wouldn't just take any advice from anyone in North America. You need to think carefully about your own environment and where your students are and what they have, rather than listening to people like me too much. So there are other approaches, of course. This is a startup that started in our startup incubator. When I first saw the Rumi project, I thought, well, I don't really know how this is going to work and how they're going to make any money. But it's been a roaring success, and it's really targeted at people in countries in Africa, where they provide a tablet with a lot of learning material on it, preloaded. And you don't need internet access. You just distribute these things in areas that don't have access. And it's been a huge boon for those countries. I imagine there's similar projects like this and other approaches. But I just threw this in here, not because I want to promote Rumi, but just because as a cautionary tale, other things work in other environments. And just because something works for me, doesn't mean that I'm recommending that you take a similar approach. In terms of adaptive learning, online learning, Newton was a product with a lot of promise. It was probably the first product aimed at high school kids, and especially their math skills, and it would adapt to what they seem to know in quizzes. And it did show, I think, early results that it actually improved people's test scores. So it was one of the first poster children for adaptive learning. But it's interesting what happened to it. It was eventually sold to a publisher. And so all that promise of that startup and just work with us, we're a new lean company and we'll solve all your problems, it's kind of evaporated in the real market. So there's all kinds of interesting inventions and things going on, but they aren't necessarily readily available to all of us in the way we would like. And so here's another example, Acrobatic. Acrobatic came out of Carnegie Mellon. Again, another adaptive learning system. Really, they did some excellent work. For each course, they would build a very complex skills graph at the back of the system. And they would see where you were, map you out in the skills graph. So what you knew, what you didn't know, they would get that information fairly quickly from regular quizzes and help you navigate through your subject, where it was calculus or whatever. And again, they had excellent early results. Very promising startup. but financially could not make a go of it and were ultimately acquired by another publisher. So this has been the case where there's all this promise of new technologies, and if we could just go and buy them from all these startups, but it hasn't actually worked that way, and they've eventually been absorbed mostly by publishers. And so that's how they're finding their way into the university via publishers and then integration with the learning management system. The learning management systems that we have are also really interesting. So this is a graph or a chart, I guess you might say, of the various LMS systems over the years and their market growth or shrinkage. And Blackboard, which is in the gray there, had the early market lead. They merged between WebCT and Blackboard. And so we all thought with one big company, they would produce for us better and better learning environments. We were hoping for things like real-time interaction between a professor and student, maybe collaborative editing of documents and so forth, but that was not the case. As a large company, they actually didn't really improve their product for years, and then as a result, Instructure, Canvas, and D2L Brightspace have been gobbling up the market from them. So this whole sector, despite all the promise, early promise in the knots, if you might say, did not deliver the kind of quality that we were looking for or the innovation we were looking for. What did happen was that we got this free from Google. And so these are just some screens from Google showing Google Docs. And we discovered that we weren't seeing new collaboration tools in the LMS, but we were seeing them from the very large providers like Google and Microsoft. And this was a huge boon to us. So for example, we'll have nursing students who are off working in hospitals and so forth and have to keep up with their work. They can work with teams on projects and so forth. And so this did for us more than any LMS ever did for us. And we've had a few of them. I just took this snapshot right after a meeting. Apologies for the quality. But the collaborative editing in real time and spreadsheets, documents, and so forth has been a major improvement. And I urge you, if you're not using real-time document editing in either Microsoft or Google's platform, that you really should take a look at it. I think it's a huge opportunity. It's such a simple thing, but it changes how we work. So this slide is just a reminder to me that before this meeting, several people were in this spreadsheet, editing it, updating it, and so forth. We got into the meeting with our laptops. As we agree to next action items and so forth, we're updating this. And when we leave, we're not waiting for someone to circulate the wrong version of a Word document. It's just there online, and we can update it as we need. So it's just been wonderful. And it's been fantastic when we've had consultants in from companies who like to run away with templates, and I'll see you in a week to tell them, no, it's all online, and that's where you're working. It's been a fabulous improvement for us. So Google is now extending this out into the classroom, and this is an opportunity we're watching closely. We're all wondering if Google Classroom continues to improve, will it mean the end of the learning management system as we've known it? And we would be quite happy to ditch our learning management system and just use Google Classroom if it improves to that point. It's not there at an administrative level, but it's certainly causing us a bit of churn because people are asking, when can I use Google Classroom instead of the LMS? Because they're used to using all of Google's other features. Within the university, I think online learning can cause some problems. And within Ryerson, what we did in order to enable online learning quickly was we set up a unit inside the continuing education department to do fully online courses. And we set up a different business model there where that continuing education got the tuition funds from students, whereas for regular teaching in programs at the university, we had a base-funded support group that would just help faculty. And the result was that continuing education was able to leap forward and produce 400 courses fairly quickly that are very popular and very successful. But they did it under a different business model than the rest of the university. And so the result was we were covering sort of two ends of the spectrum for online learning. On the left, you'll see that those are primarily face-to-face courses. In the center would be sort of blended courses where there would be a significant online component and the face-to-face component would be different, sort of flipped classrooms, if you like. And on the right-hand side, completely online. And so we created a support gap in the university. So people who wanted to teach blended courses, we really didn't have the kind of support for them that they needed. And the debate was, do we try to extend what we've done in continuing education into the blended space, or do we try to move people from face-to-face courses into the blended space? And ultimately, that's what we decided to do, because we had to make a choice about business models and how that would work in the university. So that's a tough problem to consider, how you support these things, because they are different and require different sort of models. You need a lot of instructional designers if you're fully online, and they need to work closely with your faculty. The other problem you can run into is that we all use the same LMS, but the continuing education division also needed a content management system. And so now we have the same professors teaching in different environments with different tools. And we're just going to solve that problem now by extending that CMS that continuing education is using into the whole university. So I think it's really important to think about this little chart or this line, and think about taking down barriers to move from one area to another for your faculty. Are they using the same tools? Are they getting the same level of support? Is that support from the same people? Really important to think about if you want to take advantage of the opportunities of online learning. The other thing that's changing and evolving, of course, is the cloud. So Ryerson is stuck with some very large and expensive Oracle applications for our enterprise resource planning, or our major admin applications, if you like. But many universities are moving to systems like Workday that are fully in the cloud. And if you have an opportunity to look at that as an option, I highly recommend you take a look. I can't tell you that that's the best, most cost-effective system for you, but systems like Workday, not just Workday, are certainly worthy of considering and getting that out of your data center and getting a more robust system that you have to customize less. So digital transformation is the buzzword of the year, or maybe the last few years, certainly in North America. One of the routes to success there that I've seen at several universities is to look at enterprise architecture, where you consult broadly with stakeholders, set in place some proper data and information governance and information management, really identify gaps and make a long-term roadmap to fill those gaps with something more consistent that works better for everyone. The problem with enterprise architecture engagements with consultants and so forth is they tend to be limited to individual interviews with people and limited stakeholders. And so it doesn't always produce the cultural change you may want in an organization where people are truly thinking about working differently. And so another approach that many are taking is something they're calling digital moments. And that's where basically they start with stories and they bring a lot of people in. So you might bring a bunch of faculty in who are doing research and asking them how things should work, and so on. This is an example from McMaster University where they did this online and asked people to put in their suggestions about how things should work. And that's much more effective at getting people talking about how they can use digital technologies. Some of the outcomes of these things that are worth watching and paying attention to: identity management is a big one. If you get this right, it's incredibly empowering for using those online cloud and other services. So we rolled our own identity management system many years ago, although you can buy good ones now, and probably that would be a better choice if you're just starting down this path. But identity management and resource management as well, basically just take the information out of your HR and student system and people who have to update it, and just feed that information into things like G Suite, your finance system, et cetera. And they allow you to manage accounts much more safely and securely, and the account lifecycle. So it's also a big deal in security if you're getting this done well. When we moved to Google, it was Google Apps at the time, G Suite now. It was this system that let us do it inexpensively. Ultimately, we didn't like the third-party integrator we hired and the quality of their work. We just did it ourselves, learned the API, fed the data into Google, and it was all good. And we could not have done it that easily without this system in the middle. The other part of enterprise architecture that's worth maybe emphasizing is some form of business process orchestration. So if you have disparate systems, different systems doing different things, and especially if they've been allowed to grow by individual departments in the way that just suited them, business process orchestration can just do amazing things for you in terms of automation across systems. There's so many ways to do this. We started off with Oracle's business process or people manager, and we were moving to an enterprise service bus, but something really to think about. And it really involves getting people out of HR, out of finance and so forth, getting them around the table, working closely together, and a great determination to automate things and make things easier for people. The other thing we're seeing with AI that's being jumped on, I think, in a big way, so at least in North America, and this UiPath is just one vendor. I'm not recommending them. It's just here's an easy slide to put in. But there's these systems that, you may have these older enterprise systems where perhaps someone has done an expense report and it's got to go, and an administrator has to go and review and check it in your finance system. Well, that can all be automated, and the choices they make can be done with AI just as well as actually having people. And so there's a huge interest in this now in robotic process automation that works with all of these systems, and they're relatively easy to set up. Of course, the vendors want a good share of the pie, but I think they're careful enough that they're making it less expensive to do this now with software than it is with people. Now, again, that's in North America with the North American labor rates. I don't know if that's true all around the world, but certainly I would check out robotic process automation and see if it's helpful. So I want to get into some of the uncertainties in the last few minutes. And of course, cybersecurity is one of them, but there are other ones. If you're a highly decentralized organization, that can be hard to work with or create all kinds of problems, especially around IT governance, the fragmentation of working experience at the university. So what we found in Canada was the smaller you were, the more likely you were to be centralized. And as the universities got larger and larger, and you start to see tens of thousands of students and many millions in research spending, the decentralization became more and more prevalent and more challenging. So I'll talk about that a little bit. The first one, though, is that the cloud gives people all kinds of tools to work with. And so we've seen professors say, hey, I'll use Facebook. And so, their students have to use Facebook for discussions in their course, and then the LMS for discussions in others. So this has been problematic and created a sort of fragmented experience for our students. And so we've been gradually urging people to think about tools more carefully. And the fact that we have Google's G Suite available has meant that they have a really top-line quality system as an alternative. And so more and more we're saying, can you please focus on what we have if it meets your needs? And one of the ways we've been doing that is to insist on privacy and security assessments of other tools before they go and use them. Decentralization is an interesting problem. And so what I've been promoting at the university, and there are similar approaches at other universities, is to say, let central IT do the generic work. So you may think it's less expensive for you to run your own cable or something, but they may be substandard cable, whatever. Please just let central IT do the basic generic work for you. So over the years at Ryerson, we've been taking over other people's networks in agreement with them because they realize we'll do a better job and it won't cost them anything. So you have to have the economics and financing in place to do that. With computing infrastructure, fewer and fewer people are standing up their own servers at the university and more using us. And also for application integration and development, we're doing more and more work. Where we're finding a lot of departments are still doing their own work is on customized systems that they need and user support where they want custom support. And we're fine with that. So as long as we all work together, then federated IT, as we call it, can work really well. So this is my easygoing chart to explain this. There are very few department Ds who are doing a lot of work themselves and more department As, and that's what you want to drive towards. But I like to do it with economic incentives and not brute force policies. IT governance is complicated and important, but I always say it's not a cover word for central IT taking over everything. It's really about people making decisions in their line of business in the university. And so there are some ways to facilitate that in universities. Again, I'm just talking about our experience. Yours may be different. But somebody usually has an ERP advisory committee or an administrative computing advisory committee where you bring people together from the relevant departments and they work together, plan together, and make proposals for new initiatives together. The same on the academic side. We have an academic advisory committee. Most universities have something like that where the professors from each faculty can come together with central IT and talk about issues in the future. It's been hugely helpful for us to move forward on cybersecurity, that committee. And then, there's other things you can put in place in terms of IT governance around funding reviews and so forth, so that people who are proposing new projects, their projects are seen by others and maybe changed, or there's recommendations for sharing or collaborating. So I won't read this more. Another challenge we have, which introduces a certain amount of uncertainty, you might say, is the growth of devices on campus. Just here's a graph from Ryerson. You can see that in a 10-year period, we increased our number of students by about 70%, but the increase in wireless devices on our network was enormous, and that cost us millions of dollars to catch up with. So that was a real challenge. Another challenge is the economics around cybersecurity. So this is a disgruntled high school student who paid an inexpensive booter service to do a denial of service attack against her high school and took down a whole regional network in the process. So when this was announced on the news, I went and found the booter service that she used, and here's their advertisement. And for $65, I get 7,200 seconds of knocking somebody off the internet with a denial of service attack. So it doesn't cost much money to take down an institution. And at Ryerson, we've experienced this. Excuse me. I won't read this in the interest of time, but this is what we used to have. We used to have between the internet and us one firewall. And under a repeated series of denial of service attacks, we found that wasn't enough. So we had to spend millions to put in a DDoS filtering appliance and beef up our firewall infrastructure. It looks like we went 3 times, but it's probably more like 6 or 7 times capacity. And then we now handle those DDoS attacks without any problem, but that took a huge investment. So we had to invest millions. Attackers have to invest hundreds of dollars. The other thing on the cybersecurity front in Canada was we saw within the space of a year 3 institutions taken down by ransomware attacks. Now this turned out to be the Iranians, according to the FBI, who did the SamSam attacks. But at the University of Calgary, Carleton University, and Cambrian College, they were able to own large parts of the infrastructure and take down the entire campus. So we thought we were working okay on security, but in 2016, this was a real wake-up call, and we redoubled all our efforts and started spending even more money on cybersecurity. One of the things that made us focus on was Windows infrastructure, and so if you're running Windows infrastructure, I think this is a place to spend a lot of attention and care. Everyone ended up auditing their Active Directory, making sure it was locked down properly, segmenting their networks, and so forth. And I'll leave those slides with you. Many universities went off and did security maturity assessments based on NIST or ISO 27002. And so they would get these maps back of where they were doing well and not so well, and could focus on improving their security in those areas. It might be on their policies, it might be on how they treat employees, it might be on technical controls. We also started a cybersecurity benchmarking project where we wanted to see what universities in Canada or colleges were doing things well, and we could use those practices everywhere. So we used a cybersecurity rating service, did some internal surveys ourselves from all our members, and tried to correlate that data with the survey data. We went through a long process where we looked at all the data, sort of one thing at a time, first at botnets, then spam propagation, other things where how many potentially exploited machines did you have on your network? What was your patching cadence, and so forth, and then looked at the data. So this is just a sample of the data, and I can't tell you who got the high or low score, but basically on the left axis is your cybersecurity rating. Anything below the red line is not good. Anything between the red line and the orange line is intermediate, and anything above the orange line is good or excellent. So here are the trend lines. Of course, the actual data is all over the place, but you can see that the smaller universities on the left with lower complexity index generally do better than universities and colleges on the right that are larger and more complex. Excuse me. And so one of the things we realized with these ratings was that our wireless and residence networks were bringing down our ratings. So the green line is the data without our wireless and residence networks. And so you can still see that most universities and colleges, the trend line for their data is in the basic security area. So we have some work to do. The smaller, primarily undergraduate institutions, because they're more centralized and less complex, generally have higher ratings. And so these are the sort of three categories of universities. But the main question we're asking is when we look at scores, how do people get better scores? So for botnet infections, for example, how did they do better than other people? And then we got best practices, which I won't go through because of time, but here's one example of if you're using firewalls to block botnet traffic and you introduce a domain name service firewall, you'll do much better. And so many of us have started to do this and it's improved our ratings. Some scores for patching cadence and server software updates did not relate well to people who said they had good vulnerability management practices. And so we're working on why is vulnerability management so hard and what can we do to improve our sector. There are a bunch of collaborations going on cybersecurity, so it's a big thing, I think for everyone. But we're putting a lot of attention and effort into it. We'd like to be doing other things, but this is a big focus for us. I won't go through the long list, but you can see there's a lot going on in Canada around cybersecurity. And I'll make sure these slides are distributed, or I'll pass them on, and hopefully they'll be distributed to you, and you can follow these links and read as you want.